My son sold my lake. House for his wife's dream wedding. Then the notary called me. My name is Walter Sorensen. I am 74 years old, and for most of my life I made my living with my hands, building things that were meant to last. I was a carpenter. For 50 years I framed houses, hung doors, built cabinets and stairs and docks all around the county. And the one thing my trade taught me, above everything else, is that a thing built true doesn't need to shout to hold. You measure twice and cut once. You take your time. You let the joint be tight and the level be honest. And then you can walk away and let it stand for 100 years without ever raising your voice about it. A crooked man builds loud and fast and covers the gaps with paint. An honest one builds quiet and slow and lets the work speak for itself long after he's gone. I'm telling you this because it's the heart of everything I'm about to say. For 30 years, my wife and I spent every summer at our lake house, a house I built myself, board by board, on a quiet stretch of shoreline up in the North Woods. After she passed, that house was the only place on this earth that still felt like home. It held her. It held us. And so, when my son stood in my kitchen one gray afternoon and told me, without hardly looking up from his phone, that he had handled everything and sold the lake house to pay for his wife's dream wedding, I felt the floor go out from under me. "You don't need a big empty house anymore, Dad," he said, like he was doing me a favor. "It's just sitting there." I said nothing. I stood there in my own kitchen, and I let him believe he'd won. Because there was one thing my son had forgotten, one thing he'd never bothered to check. I had never signed that house over to anyone, not to him, not to a bank, not to a soul. The deed was still in my name alone, exactly the way my wife, in the last clear-eyed days of her life, had made sure it would stay. A week later, the notary handling the sale called me directly. She was confused, she said, almost apologetic, because in the whole stack of closing papers there was a problem she couldn't get past. The signature of the real owner was missing from every single page. That was the afternoon I understood something about myself that I'd never quite had words for. My silence, all those years, all through that terrible week. It had never been weakness. It had been patience. The patience of deep, still water. But before I take you down to that lake, let me ask you something. Whoever you are listening to me tonight, where are you watching from right now? What town, what city, what quiet corner of the world? Leave a comment and tell me, so I know I'm not just talking to an empty room. It means something to an old man to know that somewhere out there, a stranger is sitting with him a while. And one honest word before we start. Some details of this story have been changed, for clarity and for the telling of it, and any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. But the lesson at the heart of it, that part, is as real as anything I know. Now, let's begin. To understand what happened to me, you have to understand that house, and the water it sat beside, and the woman I built it for. I've lived my whole life in the North Woods, in a small town called Birch Hollow, the kind of place with one main street, one diner, one hardware store, and more pine trees than people. It's a slow country. The seasons come hard and stay long, and the folks who last up there are the ones who learn to be patient, with the weather, with the ice going out in spring, with a life that doesn't hand you much fast. I was born there, and I expect I'll die there, and in between I built a good part of the town with my own two hands. But the place that was truly mine was the lake. Loon Lake, we called it. A long finger of clean cold water, about 40 minutes out of town, ringed with birch and cedar and dark stands of pine. When I was a young man, just married, I bought a scrubby lot on the North Shore for almost nothing, because nobody wanted to be that far out. And over 3 summers, on weekends and evenings, and every scrap of time I could steal, I built us a house on it. Just me, mostly, with my father's old tools and a borrowed truck. I cut the floor joists and set them true. I framed the walls square. I built the big stone fireplace stone by stone, hauling the rocks up from the shoreline. I made the wide front porch face west, so we could watch the sun go down over the water every single evening of our lives. It wasn't a mansion. It was a plain, honest house. 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, that big fireplace, and a dock I built out into the still water where a man could sit with a cup of coffee and watch the mist come up at dawn. But there wasn't a board in it I hadn't touched. There wasn't a nail I hadn't driven. That house wasn't just where we lived our summers. It was 30 years of my life. made solid. It was my heart with a roof on it. My wife's name was Margaret, Maggie. I married her when I was 23, and she was the smartest person I ever knew. A great deal smarter than me, and she'd be the first to tell you so, laughing. I was good with wood and stone. She was good with people. Where I could look at a beam and know in a second if it was true, she could look at a person and know in a second if they were. Walt, she used to say, you read the grain, I read the folks. And she was never wrong. Not once in 50 years was she wrong about a person. Let me give you one example, so you know the kind of gift she had. Years back, a smooth-talking fellow came through the county selling shares in some development scheme. Lakefront lots, big returns, get in early. He was well-dressed, easy to like, had a folder full of official-looking papers, and half the men in town were lining up to hand him their savings. I nearly did myself. It all looked solid to me. Maggie sat across from him at our kitchen table for 20 minutes, poured his coffee, said hardly a word. After he left, she said just this: Walt, if you do any building for that man, you get every dollar up front, and you don't put 1 cent of our own money anywhere near him. He's got the eyes of a man who promises and doesn't pay. I did what she said, took my fee in advance, invested nothing. 6 months later, that fellow had vanished with the savings of half the county, and the only folks who ever got a thing out of him were the ones, like me, who'd been paid before he ran. She'd read him in 20 minutes off nothing but his eyes and the set of his mouth. I'd sat with him an hour and seen a nice man with good papers. So, when Maggie told me our own son and his wife looked at our house the way a person looks at a thing they mean to have, I should have listened the first time. But a man goes blind about his own blood in a way he never does about a stranger. Maggie never went blind, not even about the people she loved most. That was her gift and, I think, her burden. To see clear, even when seeing clear, broke her heart. We couldn't have but one child, a son. And I'll get to him, because I have to, even where it hurts. But first you need to know about the last thing Maggie ever did for me. The thing she did quietly, from a hospital bed, that ended up saving the one place on earth I had left. Because it was there, in those last still days beside her, that the final word of this whole story was written down, long before any of it began. My father, who taught me the trade, taught me something else too, out on that lake when I was a boy. We'd be sitting in the boat, not a fish biting, and I'd start to fidget, wanting to move, wanting to make something happen, and he'd put a hand on my shoulder and say, "Easy, Walter, still water holds the most. You don't chase what's deep, you wait for it." I didn't understand him then. I was a boy. I wanted noise and motion. It took me most of my life to learn what that old man knew, that the loudest man in the room is usually the emptiest, that the deepest things move slow or don't seem to move at all, and that patience, real patience, the kind that looks like weakness to a fool, is the strongest force there is. Remember that. Still water holds the most. It's the whole of what I have to teach you tonight. Before I tell you how it all came apart, let me keep you a moment longer in the world as it was, back when it ran true. Because you can't measure what a man nearly lost unless you know what it was worth to him. There was a workbench in the shed behind the lake house that I built before I built anything else, before the walls, before the fireplace. A carpenter builds his bench first. It's the one tool you make with your own hands to make everything else. Mine was heavy maple, and I'd worn a hollow in it over 30 years, the way water wears a hollow in stone. Every rainy afternoon at that lake, I'd be out in that shed, working on something. A chair, a birdhouse, a new plank for the dock, a little wooden boat for Kevin when he was small. And I'd hear Maggie step on the gravel, and she'd bring me coffee and stand in the doorway watching me work, and we wouldn't say much of anything at all. That was the sound of my happiness, if happiness has a sound. The plane hissing over a board, the rain on the shed roof, Maggie's quiet in the doorway, the lake out past her, flat and still. My trade taught me a way of seeing that never left me, and I'll pass a piece of it to you because it turned out to matter more than I ever guessed. A good carpenter learns to tell true from false by feel. You run your hand down a board and you know if it's straight before any level tells you. You look at a joint and you know if it's honest or if somebody filled the gaps with putty and paint to fake it. 50 years of that, and you can't turn it off. You start seeing which people are built true and which ones are all putty and paint over a gap. Maggie had that gift about folks from the day she was born. I had to build mine, board by board, and I was slower at it than she was. Slower, especially, about my own son, because a father's love fills in a boy's gaps with putty without him ever meaning to. But the deepest thing that shed in that lake taught me was the thing my father said in the boat. Still water holds the most. In the workshop, it came out a little different. Measure twice, cut once, take your time, let the glue set, don't force the joint. But it was the same truth wearing work clothes. The good and lasting things can't be hurried. You can hurry a cheap thing, a loud thing, a thing meant to fall apart, but a thing built to last, a marriage, a home, a life that you build slow and quiet and true, and then you let it stand. And when somebody comes along loud and fast and in a hurry to tear it down or take it away, the very slowness you built it with becomes the thing that saves it. That's what my son never understood. He lived his whole life in a hurry, and a hurried man cannot beat a patient one. He can only wear himself out against him, like water against a thing set deep. I sold most of my tools when I retired, but I kept that maple workbench. It's still out in the shed at the lake. Some evenings I go out and just put my hands flat on it, in the hollow my own arms wore over 30 years, and it steadies me, the way a familiar thing does. It has seen every good hour of my life, and it was there, running my hand along its worn top, that I did a good deal of the hard thinking I'm about to tell you about. A man thinks clearest at the place where he once built things true. I have to tell you about Kevin, and I'm going to try to tell it straight, even the parts that shame me as a father, because a story without the truth in it isn't worth your time. Kevin is my only child. He's 44 now. When he was a boy, I used to take him up to the lake every chance I got, the way my father took me. I taught him to fish off that dock. I taught him to bait a hook and to sit still and wait, though the waiting never came easy to him. Even as a little boy, Kevin wanted things now. He'd cast his line and reel it in 10 seconds later, sure the fish should already be there. "They're not biting, Dad," he'd say, frustrated. And I'd tell him what my father told me. "Easy, son. Still water holds the most. You have to wait for it." He'd sigh and drop the line back in. But the patience never took root in him the way it took in me. I've thought about that a great deal since. Maybe some of what came later was already there in that boy who couldn't sit still long enough to let the deep water give up what it held. He was a good kid, understand me. I want to say that plainly because it matters. He wasn't cruel, he was restless, and he was hungry for a bigger life than Birch Hollow could give him. Let me tell you one thing about him as a boy, because it's the thing I grieve for in all this. Not the house, but this. When Kevin was maybe 9, we were up at the lake, and a bad storm blew in fast, the way they do up there, and it knocked an old widow's dock half to pieces down the shore. Mrs. Lindgren, a lonely old soul who'd lost her husband. The next morning I went down to help her fix it, and Kevin came along, and he worked beside me all day in the cold without one complaint, holding boards, fetching nails, his little hands blue. And when we were done, Mrs. Lindgren tried to press a few dollars on me for the lumber, and I wouldn't take it because you don't take money from a widow for fixing her dock. On the drive home, Kevin asked me why I did it for free, and I told him, "Son, there are times a person's hurting, and you don't count the cost, you just help." He thought about that a good while. And then the next weekend, that boy took every dollar out of his own piggy bank, his whole summer's worth of saved up quarters, and walked it down the shore and gave it to Mrs. Lindgren for a nicer dock. He had a heart on him the size of the lake, my Kevin, when he was small. I cried that day from the pure sweetness of him. I've held on to that memory hard these last couple of years because I've needed it. When a grown man stands in your kitchen and tells you he's sold your home to throw a party, you go hunting for the boy who emptied his piggy bank for a widow, and you pray to God he's still in there somewhere, buried deep. For a long while I couldn't find him, but I never stopped looking. A father doesn't. I'll tell you, at the end, whether I found him again. He left for the city at 18, and I was proud of him for it. He got into sales, then into some business ventures, always chasing the big score, the deal that would set him up for good, and some of them did all right for a while. But Kevin had a way of spending tomorrow's money today, of needing the nice car and the nice watch to prove he'd made it before he'd actually made it. Every few years there'd be a stretch where he stopped answering my calls, and I'd know, the way a father knows, that things had gone sideways again. He married young, a good girl named Sarah, and they had a daughter, my granddaughter Emma. But the marriage didn't last. Sarah couldn't live with the ups and downs, the money always tight or always flush, and after a few hard years they divorced. Kevin got Emma every other week, and to his credit, he never missed his time with her. She was the one thing that seemed to reach the better part of him. And then, about 2 years ago, he met Ashley. I want to be fair to Ashley because bitterness makes a poor witness, and I don't want to be a poor witness. But I'll tell you what I saw. Ashley wanted a certain kind of life. The big one, the shining one, the one you put on display. She and Kevin got married quick, down at the courthouse, and I always felt that eat at her, that she'd been cheated of the wedding she'd always pictured. She wanted the ballroom, the 300 guests, the dress, the whole grand show. And Kevin, who could never stand to disappoint the woman in front of him, who confused big gestures with love, promised her he'd give it to her. He promised her the dream wedding. He just didn't have the money for it. He never had the money for anything he promised. And that's the thing about a promise you can't keep. It doesn't just sit there quietly. It grows teeth. Kevin had told Ashley she'd get her grand day, the ballroom, the 300 guests, the whole shining show. And once a man like Kevin says a thing like that out loud, he'd rather do almost anything than take it back and look small in front of the woman he's trying to hold on to. So the promise sat on him and pressed, and the deadline came on, and the money wasn't there and was never going to be there. And a man in that spot starts looking around for something to sell, something big, something that isn't quite his. I've watched it happen to men my whole life, good enough men mostly, who dug themselves a hole one shovel of pride at a time, and then went looking for someone else's ground to climb out on. Only this time, the ground he went looking for was mine. Maggie saw it before I did. Maggie saw everything before I did. Walt, she told me once, quiet after they'd left from a visit. That young woman looks at this house the way a person looks at a thing they mean to have, and our Kevin will hand her whatever she asks for, because he'd rather drown than tell her no. You watch. There's trouble coming, and it's coming for what we built. I told her she was being hard on the girl. She just gave me that patient, sad look she had, and let it go. She was right, of course. She was always right about the folks. But the one bright thread through all of it was Emma, my granddaughter. She's 8 now, all knees and elbows and a gap where her front tooth fell out, and a laugh that fills a room. And she loved that lake house the way I loved it. Every summer, Kevin would bring her up, and I'd take her out on the dock in the early morning, just the two of us, and teach her to fish the way my father taught me. Sit still, Emma Bug, I'd whisper. Still water holds the most. And that little girl, she got it. She'd sit there quiet as a stone, watching her line, patient as an old woman, and when a fish finally took it, she'd shriek loud enough to scare the loons off the whole lake. Those mornings on the dock with Emma are the finest thing left in my life. There's a particular hour just after dawn, when the lake goes so flat and still it turns into a mirror, and the mist sits on it in low white ribbons, and the only sound is the loons and the little creak of the dock. Emma and I would sit in that hour together, not talking, our lines in the glass calm water, and I'd watch that busy little girl go slowly quiet and still beside me, learning the thing my father taught me and I taught her father, that you don't chase what's deep, you wait for it. And the waiting is where the peace lives. Whatever else I've done or failed to do in this life, I gave that child those mornings. And nobody, I decided, was going to take the place where they happened. Hold on to her, in your mind, as I tell you the rest. Because this whole story, in the end, comes down to what we hand to the ones who come after us, and what we refuse to let be taken from them. Maggie got sick 3 winters ago. It started small, the way these things do, and then it moved through her faster than either of us was ready for. I spent that last year driving her to the city for treatments, sitting in waiting rooms, learning words I never wanted to know. And through all of it, she worried more about me than about herself. Who's going to feed you, Walt, when I'm gone? You can't so much as boil an egg? She'd laugh, and it would break my heart clean in 2. It was near the end, in one of the good clear stretches between the bad days, that Maggie did the thing I have to tell you about. The thing that changed everything. She had me bring her the folder. The old accordion folder, where we kept the deed to the lake house, the tax papers, all of it. She spread it out on the hospital tray table, and she took my hand, and she said, in that steady voice she used when her mind was made up, "Walter, we need to talk about the lake house." I didn't want to. Talking about papers while she was slipping away from me felt like a kind of blasphemy, but she held on to my hand. "Listen to me. I'm going first, and you're going to be here alone. And a man alone, an old man alone, grieving. He's the easiest mark in the world. I want to make sure that no one can ever take that house from you. Not a bank, not a stranger, not even our own son. Maggie, I said, Kevin would never. Walt. She looked at me with those eyes that read the folks. I love that boy with my whole heart. But I know him better than you do because you look at him with your love, and I look at him with my head. He is weak, and he is drowning in debt, and he has married a woman who will never stop wanting more. When I'm gone, they are going to come to this house looking at the walls instead of looking at you. And when they do, I want the papers to speak plain. Then she told me what she'd done and what she wanted. The lake house had always been in my name alone, just the way I'd bought it all those years ago, and we'd simply never changed it. Maggie wanted it kept that way, clean and clear, no joint owners, no shortcuts, nothing anyone could twist. She made me promise to keep every document in order, in that folder, and, most of all, never to sign a single thing about that house without first sitting down with someone I trusted and reading every word. Promise me, Walt. Promise me you won't let some piece of paper be pushed under your hand in a bad moment. The important things are never signed in grief. You hear me? Never in grief. I promised. To ease her, mostly, in the moment, not really understanding. The way you promise anything to someone you love who is leaving you. That night, though, Maggie wanted to say one more thing, and weak as she was, she made herself say it, because it mattered to her more than her own comfort. She took my hand again, and she said, Walter, I married you because you were the kindest man I ever met. But your kindness, the thing I love most in you, is also your soft spot. You see the good in people even after it's gone. You still see that little boy with a piggy bank inside a grown man who's learned to count every angle. I don't. I see the man he's become. And I'm telling you, when I'm gone, your kindness is going to blind you at the exact moment you most need to see. They'll count on that. They'll count on you giving in because your heart's too tender to say no to your own boy. Promise me that when that moment comes, and it's coming, you'll remember this. That behind my kindness, you'll put my head. The hard, clear head you don't have. Not because you're a fool, but because your heart runs too warm. I wept that night because I knew she was right. I've always been the man who forgives too much, who believes too long, who'd empty his own piggy bank for a widow, same as that boy did. And she knew it. And knowing it, she was leaving me her clear-eyed sight like a pair of spectacles for a man who couldn't see danger up close. I promise, Maggie, I said. When the time comes, I'll put your head behind my heart. She smiled, eased, and slept holding my hand. I didn't know how soon I'd need those spectacles. But when the moment came, the day my son stood in my kitchen with the sale already done, it was those very words that stopped me from folding. It was Maggie's clear head, loaned to my too soft heart, that said, Don't sign. Don't melt. Wait. Let the papers speak. But she wasn't finished. She wanted to make out her own will, too, in those days, with a lawyer she'd chosen herself, a careful woman up in the city. And in that will, I'd only learn this later, at exactly the moment it mattered, she left something not for me, but for someone else. For a little girl with a gap in her teeth who loved the lake. But I'll come to that when the time is right. Maggie died on a Sunday evening, at home, in our own bed, with my hand in hers and the lake wind moving the curtains. The last thing she said to me, so soft I had to lean in, was this. Don't raise your voice, Walt. Still water holds the most. Just let the papers speak. They tell the truth even when we're too broken to say it. And then she closed her eyes, and the quiet in that house was never the same again. We buried her on a bright, cold morning in the little cemetery outside town, next to her own mother and father. Half of Birch Hollow came, because everyone had loved Maggie. Kevin was there, with Ashley and Emma. He cried, my son, and I believed his grief because she was his mother too. Emma stood beside me and held my hand and squeezed it hard with her small fingers, like she was trying to give an old man some of her strength. At one point during the service, she looked up at me with her eyes full of tears and whispered, Grandpa, can Grandma see us now, from up there? And I had to swallow hard before I could answer her. She can, Emma Bug, I said. She sees everything we do. So, we've got to be good. Always. Even now that she's not here. I didn't know yet how true those words would turn out to be. I didn't know that Maggie really would keep watching over us, and keep protecting us through the papers she'd left behind. But That little girl, without meaning to, had said something true. Grandma could still see us, and anyone fixing to do something shameful would have done well to remember it. I think back often to that moment, Emma's small hand in mine, in front of Maggie's grave. 3 generations there in the cold, the woman leaving us, the old man staying, the child coming up, and right in the middle, invisible, the crack. Because a few feet away stood Kevin, crying real tears. I believe that still, and already, somewhere behind those tears, turning over the thought of the lake house and the wedding and the money. How does a man weep honestly for his mother and, in the same breath, plan to rob his father 2 months on? I don't know. The human heart is a board with a knot in it, sound wood and rot in the very same grain. And sometimes it only takes a debt, an unhappy wife, a weakness never mastered for the rotten part to take the load. I went back to the lake house after, alone, and I sat on the porch I'd built, watching the sun go down over the water the way Maggie and I had watched it 1,000 times. I wasn't thinking about deeds or papers or promises. I was just a broken old man, missing the other half of himself. I had no idea that within a matter of weeks, my own son would stand in that house and try to sell the ground out from under me, and that Maggie, from her hospital bed, had already quietly built the wall that would stop him. It was a gray afternoon in early fall, maybe 2 months after we buried Maggie, when Kevin came by my place in town. I was still living in our little house in Birch Hollow through the week and going up to the lake on weekends, because the lake was where I could still feel her. I heard his car in the drive, and then he came in without knocking. He had a key for emergencies, and found me at the kitchen table. He wasn't the grieving son from the funeral. He was brisk, distracted, a man come to take care of some business. He had his phone in his hand and he kept glancing at it while he talked, the way people do now, like the person in front of them is only half of what deserves their attention. "Hey, Dad, so, listen, I wanted to talk to you about the lake house." "All right," I said. "You know Ashley and I have got the wedding coming up in the spring, the real one, the one she's always wanted." He said it fast, rehearsed. "And these things are expensive, Dad, more than you'd believe. And I've been thinking, that lake house is just sitting up there empty most of the year now. It's a lot of house for one person. The upkeep, the property taxes, the drive. It doesn't make sense anymore. So," he finally looked up from the phone. "I went ahead and handled everything. I found a buyer. Good price, cash, quick close. It's basically done. The money's going to cover the wedding, and honestly, it'll be a weight off you, not having to worry about the place." I sat very still. I need you to understand what went through me in that moment, because it's important. It wasn't rage, not at first. It was a grief so deep it took the air out of me. Not for the house, not yet. For him, for my son. I had buried my wife 8 weeks before, and here was my boy at my kitchen table telling me he'd sold the one place on earth that still held her, to throw a party, and that I ought to thank him for the favor. I looked at his face, the face of the little boy I'd taught to fish off that very dock, and I searched for that boy in there. I couldn't find him. There was just a tired, cornered man with debts and a wife who wanted a ballroom. "You don't need a big empty house anymore, Dad," he said, softer now, mistaking my silence for agreement. "It's just sitting there full of ghosts. This is better. For everybody." Full of ghosts. He meant his mother. Those 2 words did something to me that his whole speech about upkeep and taxes hadn't. Full of ghosts. To him, the place where his mother and I had spent 30 summers, where he'd learned to fish, where I'd built every board with my own hands. To him, it was just square footage sitting empty, a problem to be liquidated, ghosts to be cleared out. To me, every corner of that house was Maggie, the kitchen where she hummed, the porch where we watched the sun go down 10,000 times, the dock where she read her books with her feet in the water. He called that ghosts and a big empty house. In those few words was the whole distance between his world and mine. He saw boards to sell. I saw a life to keep, and that was the moment something settled in me, quiet and cold and certain, like a plumb line finding true. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I didn't shout, "How dare you?" I didn't tell him his mother wasn't 2 months in the ground. I thought of Maggie, of her last words to me. "Don't raise your voice, Walt. Still water holds the most. Just let the papers speak." And I understood, sitting there, that my wife hadn't only left me a house. She'd left me something stronger and quieter than any anger. She'd left me the truth, written down, waiting. So, I did the thing that threw him completely. I didn't fight. I nodded, slow, like a tired old man giving in. I see, I said, my voice small. Well, you've thought it all through then. Kevin relaxed all over. He'd braced for a war and found a beaten old man instead. He smiled, a smile that meant to be warm, but was only relieved. I have, Dad. I promise it's the right thing. You'll see. He stood, and on his way out, he squeezed my shoulder. I'll handle all the paperwork. You won't have to lift a finger. You won't have to lift a finger. He had no idea how right he was, because there was one finger the whole thing depended on, the one that would sign the deed. And that finger was mine. Only mine. I sat alone at that table a long time after his car pulled away. Then I got up, and I went to the closet, and I took down the old accordion folder Maggie had spread across a hospital tray table and made me promise to keep. I opened it, and I found the deed to the lake house, and I read the top line, the way I'd read 1,000 levels to see if they ran true. Owner, Walter J. Sorensen. Just that, just me. Thank you, Maggie, I whispered to the empty kitchen. You were right. You were always right. Now, rest easy. I won't raise my voice. I'll just let the papers speak. And I folded that deed back up, as careful as I'd ever handled anything meant to last. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in my chair in the dark, with the deed on the table in front of me, and I let the whole thing turn over and over in my mind. I thought about how a man gets to a place like that, how the boy I taught to fish, the boy who cried at his mother's grave, becomes a man who sells his father's home out from under him and calls it a kindness. I didn't have an answer. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe weakness works like water on stone, slow, patient, invisible, until one day the whole thing gives way and you wonder how you never saw the crack. I thought about Maggie too, most of that night. About the 1,000 ordinary evenings on that porch, her with a book and me with a piece of sandpaper and some little project, neither of us saying much, the loons calling out on the water. About how she'd have handled this if it were her still here and me already gone. And I knew, without a doubt, that she'd have been steadier than me. She'd have set her jaw and kept her papers close and never lost a wink of sleep because she saw people clear and was never surprised by them. It was me who kept getting surprised. Me who kept hoping, against all the evidence, that the boy with the piggy bank would come walking back through the door. Sitting there in the dark, I made myself borrow her steadiness. I asked her for it, out loud, like a fool talking to an empty chair. And I'll tell you, it came. Maybe it was just memory. Maybe it was more. But some of her clear, unsurprised strength settled into me that night, and it never quite left. And I'll confess something to you, because it would be dishonest to hide it. Somewhere in that long night, I was tempted to just let it go. To think, let him have it. Let him sell it. I'm an old man, alone, my wife is gone. What do I need with a lake house full of ghosts? Maybe he's right. Maybe I'll go quiet into some small apartment in town and wait to join Maggie and let the boy have his party. Maybe peace is worth more than pine boards. It was then that I turned on the lamp, and the light fell on something I'd forgotten was there, propped on the shelf beside my chair. A little frame drawing Emma had made me the summer before, a child's crayon picture of the lake house, with a stick figure old man and a stick figure little girl standing on a lopsided dock, a big yellow sun over the water, and underneath, in her careful wobbly letters, "To the best grandpa at the lake." I looked at that drawing a long while, and the temptation to give up drained right out of me, because I understood that if I gave in, if I let them take it, I wouldn't only be failing myself and failing Maggie's memory. I'd be failing that little girl. I'd be teaching her by my example that the good ones step aside, that the loudest and the pushiest win, that patience and decency are just other words for being a doormat. And I did not want Emma to learn that from the world. I wanted to teach her the opposite, that still water holds the most, that a decent man doesn't have to shout to stand his ground, that the truth, patient and quiet, wins in the end. "All right, Maggie," I said out loud to the dark. "I won't give up, not for the boards, for the girl. I'll show her how it's done. I'll let the papers speak." And for the first time since I'd buried my wife, I went to bed with a purpose. The grief was still there, enormous, filling the house. But underneath the grief now, there was something hard and calm and level, like a foundation, poured deep, set true, waiting for whatever they'd try to build on top of it to fall. Over the next few days, I did what a carpenter does before he cuts. I measured. Quietly, carefully, I set about finding out exactly what my son had already put in motion. I didn't confront him. I played the tired, beaten old man he thought I was. Yes, Kevin, whatever's easiest, my head's not in it these days. And I watched, and I listened, and I made a few calls of my own around a small town where everybody knows everybody. And piece by piece, the shape of it came clear. Kevin hadn't been bluffing. He really had lined up a sale. He'd found a buyer, an out-of-town fellow looking for lakefront, willing to pay cash and close fast. No questions, no inspection to speak of. Kevin had told this buyer and told the closing office handling the paperwork that he was acting for his elderly father, that the old man was on board, but not really up to dealing with the details on account of his grief and his age. He'd made himself the point man on the whole thing. He was going to walk it right up to the closing table and get it done, and hand me a pen at the last minute. Or, I began to suspect, as the picture filled in, maybe not hand me a pen at all, because here's the crack that started to show. In our state, that lake house couldn't be sold without the signature of its legal owner in front of a notary. And the legal owner was me, and only me. Kevin knew that. He wasn't a stupid man. So, how did he mean to close a sale on a house he didn't own, without the owner's signature? There were only two answers, and both of them turned my stomach. One was that he planned to bring me to the table at the 11th hour, grief-blind and worn down, and push the papers under my hand fast, betting I'd sign whatever was in front of me, because I was too tired and too sad to read it. The important things are never signed in grief, Maggie had said. He was counting on exactly that. And the other answer, the one I could hardly let myself think, was that he didn't mean to have me sign at all. That somewhere in that stack of documents, my name was going to appear in a hand that wasn't mine. I didn't want to believe my own son capable of that. No father does. But Maggie's voice was in my ear now, the head where the heart wanted to look away. Read the folks, Walt. And a man drowning in debt, with a wife demanding a ballroom and a deadline bearing down, is a man who might reach for a shortcut he'd never take on dry land. Desperation walks a man past doors he swore he'd never open. And there was one more thing in those weeks that told me how far it had gone. And it hurt worse than any of the paperwork. They stopped bringing me Emma. Little excuses at first. She's got soccer. She's not feeling great. Next weekend, Dad, I promise. The weekends came and went, and no Emma. The one or two times I did see her, it was rushed, supervised, Ashley hovering. And I understood why, the same cold way I understood the rest, because a child tells the truth. If somebody asked Emma, "Is your grandpa confused, honey? Is he not doing so well?" she'd have laughed and said, "No, Grandpa knows everything. Grandpa's teaching me to fish. Grandpa built the whole house." A granddaughter who loves you is living proof that you're not some feeble old fool. And they couldn't have proof like that running around loose. So they kept her from me. They didn't just want my house. They wanted me alone, cut off from the one small person whose love would have told the whole world I was fine. There was an afternoon I'll never forget. I happened to be driving past Emma's school, and I saw her come out, and her whole face lit up. "Grandpa!" And she started to run to my truck. And Ashley, waiting there, caught her by the arm and steered her away fast, saying something in her ear without so much as a nod to me. And Emma looked back over her shoulder as she was pulled off and lifted one small hand in a little stolen wave. I sat there in my truck with my hand raised too, watching my only grandchild get hauled away from me like I was something dangerous. Like the grandpa who taught her still water holds the most, had turned overnight into a man a child needed protecting from. I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel, and somewhere on that drive, I stopped being afraid of them and got angry instead. The slow, deep, patient kind of angry that doesn't blow over. They could try for the house, but they were not going to steal that little girl's grandfather from her. Not that. Never that. So I did two things. First, I took that deed and every paper Maggie had made me keep, and I put the whole folder somewhere safe, out of my house, where no one could get to it. And second, I remembered Maggie's other instruction, the one I'd promised her and half forgotten. Never sign a thing about that house without sitting down with someone you trust. It was time to find that person, and, as it turned out, I wouldn't have to look for her at all. Because a few days later, my phone rang, and the person on the other end of the line was exactly the one I needed, calling me for a reason I never saw coming. It was a Tuesday morning. I was out on the dock at the lake. I'd driven up to be near Maggie, when my phone rang with a number I didn't know. I almost let it go. I'm glad to this day that I didn't. "Is this Mr. Walter Sorensen?" a woman's voice said. "The Walter Sorensen who owns the property on the north shore of Loon Lake?" "That's me," I said. "My name is Diane Whitfield. I'm the notary and closing agent handling a sale of that property. Mr. Sorensen, I'm sorry to call you out of the blue, and I hope you'll forgive me if I've got this all wrong, but I've been going through this closing file, and something isn't right, and I couldn't let it sit. Can I ask you a few questions?" My heart was going, but I kept my voice easy. "Ask away." "Are you selling your lake house, Mr. Sorensen?" There was a long pause on my end. The loons were calling out on the still water, and I made a decision in that pause to tell this stranger the plain truth. "No, ma'am," I said. "I am not." I heard her let out a breath. "That's what I was afraid of. Mr. Sorensen, I have a full set of closing documents on my desk for the sale of your property. Your son, Kevin, has been handling the transaction on your behalf, representing that you're the seller and that you've agreed to everything. The closing is scheduled for the end of this week." She paused. "But here's what's been bothering me for 3 days now, and why I finally decided to call the owner of record directly, which I very rarely do. In this entire stack of documents, on every single page that requires the owner's signature, the real owner's signature is missing. There's a signature there on some of the copies, but it's not one you ever gave in front of me, or in front of any notary I can find a record of. And the more I looked at it, the less it looked like the hand of a man who signed his own name for 74 years. Mr. Sorensen, did you sign any of these papers?" "I have never," I said slowly, "signed a single paper about selling that house. Not one. In my life." The line was quiet a moment. "Then this sale," Diane Whitfield said, and her voice had gone hard and steady, "is not going to happen, not through me. Because what you've just told me means that somewhere in this file is a signature that was put there by someone who was not you. And I have spent a long time in this business, Mr. Sorensen, making very sure that never happens on my watch. Never." I sat down on the edge of the dock, my legs suddenly not so sure under me. Out on the water, the mist was lifting off Loon Lake the way it had lifted every morning of my life. And I understood, all at once, what Maggie had done for me, and what this stranger had just done for me, and what my son had tried to do to me. Kevin had never meant to bring me to the table at all. He'd meant to close a sale on my house with a signature that wasn't mine. I sat with that for a long moment on the dock, turning it over, feeling it settle into me like cold water. My own son. Not just a man cutting a corner, not just a man in a hurry, a man willing to put my name on paper in a hand that wasn't mine, to take from me the last place his mother and I had shared. It's a strange thing to have the worst you feared about someone you love turn out to be true. There's a grief in it, of course, but there's also, God help me, a kind of relief, because now, at least, I could stop arguing with myself. I could stop making excuses for him inside my own head, the way I'd done his whole life. The putty was chipped away, and I could see the gap plain, and you can't fix a gap you won't look at. And Maggie had seen it coming from a hospital bed, and had made sure the one thing standing between my son and my home was the one thing he could never forge and never move. The truth of whose name was on that deed, and the promise she'd drawn out of me never to sign in grief. "Ma'am," I said when I could find my voice, "I think you better tell me everything, and I think there's some things I'd better tell you too." "Yes," she said. "I think we should meet. And Mr. Sorensen, I'm so sorry. I've seen this before, closer to home than I like to say. You're not going to go through it alone." That afternoon, sitting on the dock long after she'd hung up, I finally understood the thing about myself I told you at the very start. My silence in that kitchen through that whole terrible week had never once been weakness. It had been patience. The patience of deep, still water, waiting for the truth to surface on its own. And it had. Let me stop a moment right here before I take you any further. Because what comes next is the hardest part of my story. The part where I had to sit across a table from my own son and let the truth come out about what he'd done. And I don't want to walk through it alone. If you've stayed with me this far, if this old man and his lake house have come to mean anything to you tonight, do me one small kindness. Down in the comments, type 2 words. I'm here. That's all. Just so I know somebody's out there in the dark with me, walking this stretch of road alongside an old fool who thought, for a few weeks, that he'd been left all alone in the world. It means more than you know to hear a stranger say, I'm here. And let me say again, plainly, what honesty requires me to repeat. Some details of this story have been changed for the telling of it, and any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. But the lesson is real. God, is it real? Because I have to tell you something, friend. Something that might one day protect somebody you love. What happened to me is not rare. It's happening quietly in towns and cities all over, right now, tonight. All over this country, there are old people, just widowed, worn thin by grief, owning a little something, a house, some savings. And around them, slowly, hands begin to close. Sometimes those hands belong to strangers, to scammers on the phone with warm, practiced voices. But far more often, and this is the deepest ache of it, they belong to family, to sons and daughters, to the blood of your own blood. It starts with a signature they want you to put down so you don't have to worry about it. It goes on with the visits that thin out, the grandchild kept away, the quiet campaign to make you feel confused and useless and alone. And it can end, in the worst cases, with someone trying to sell what's yours, or trying to have you declared unfit to run your own life, so they can run it for you. It has a lot of names: financial elder abuse, undue influence, elder fraud. But it's always the same thing underneath: taking an old person's life out of their hands and calling it help. And the cruelest part, the part I know from the inside now, is how it makes the victim doubt himself. How a person can start to wonder, in the lonely hours, whether maybe they are just a confused old fool, whether maybe the ones taking everything are right after all. They aren't. If that's you, listening tonight, hear an old carpenter say it plain. You are not a fool for having built something, and you are not a burden for wanting to keep it. If, listening to me, you've been thinking of somebody, a parent, a grandparent, an old neighbor whose relative has gotten a little too interested, a little too helpful, a little too fast, then listen to that feeling. You're not a bad person for wondering, and you're not alone in it. There are people whose whole job is to help. Lawyers, notaries, and closing agents like the good woman who called me, adult protective services, elder care advocates. You can ask questions, you can ask for time, and above all, remember this, and teach it to everyone you love who's getting on in years. The important things are never signed in a hurry, never in grief, never under pressure. An honest person always gives you time to think and to have the papers read by someone you trust. The one who rushes you, who frightens you, who doesn't want any witnesses in the room, that one, 9 times out of 10, is trying to take something from you. Keep all that somewhere safe for later. Now, take my arm again, because it's right here that I stopped being alone. It's right here that I met the person who, long before she ever heard my name, had lived through almost exactly what my son was trying to do to me, and who, because of it, was ready to stand between me and the water. We met 2 days later in a quiet back booth at the diner in town, away from anyone who might carry tales. Diane Whitfield turned out to be a woman in her early 60s, plain-spoken and careful, with reading glasses on a chain and a way of choosing her words like she was laying each one down on a level. She had a folder with her, thick with the closing documents, and she set it on the table between us the way you'd set down something you didn't much like touching. Before we got to my business, she told me a little of hers, and I understood then why my old friend Hank, I'll get to Hank, had said when I told him her name, "Oh, you're in good hands with that one. Ask her about her folks sometime. She'll set the world right for you if she can." "Mr. Sorensen," she said, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, "I want you to know why I called you, because it's not something most closing agents would have done. Most would have flagged the file, kicked it back, covered themselves, and let it die quiet without ever picking up the phone. I called the owner of record directly because of my father." She looked out the window a moment. "When I was a girl, my dad had a little farm. Good land, in the family 3 generations. My mother died young, and after that my dad's brother, my uncle, started coming around. Real friendly, real helpful. Started telling my dad he was getting forgetful, getting old, shouldn't be handling the place alone. Got him to sign a few things he didn't understand. And then, When my dad caught on and tried to stop it, my uncle went to a judge and had my father declared incompetent, said he couldn't manage his own affairs. I was away, young, didn't understand what was happening till it was over. By the time I got home, the land was sold, the money was gone, and my father was living in a rented room in town, convinced he really was losing his mind, because a court had told him so. He wasn't. He was just old and alone, and nobody stood up for him in time. He died believing he was a foolish old man who'd lost everything. He was the smartest, gentlest man I ever knew. She turned her coffee cup, another slow half-turn. You want to know the thing that still keeps me up at night, Mr. Sorensen? The last few times I talked to my dad on the phone, he'd say to me, real quiet, "Diane, something's not right out here. Your uncle keeps having me sign things I don't understand." And I was young and busy, building my own life, and I'd tell him, "Dad, don't worry. Uncle's just helping. It's probably routine." I didn't listen. I mistook the sound of a man being robbed for the sound of a man getting old, and that's exactly what they count on. They want you to hear the victim's alarm as an old person's babbling, so nobody comes running, so he stays alone with them. By the time I understood, it was done. He got there ahead of me, and I got there in time to watch my father die believing he was a fool. She let out a slow breath. So, when I saw that file, a son handling everything, a grieving father who was never once in my office, a signature that didn't sit right, I heard my uncle's voice all over again. And this time, I picked up the phone before it was too late. She took off her glasses and pressed the bridge of her nose. "That's why I do this work the way I do it, Mr. Sorensen. I couldn't save my father, but I made myself a promise that no old man was going to lose his home, on my desk, on my watch, because I looked the other way. When I saw that owner's signature that wasn't right, when I saw a son handling everything for a grieving father who was never in the room, I heard my uncle's voice all over again, and I picked up the phone. We sat quiet a moment, the two of us, an old carpenter and a careful woman, joined by the same wound from opposite ends of a life. Then she opened the folder and got down to it. She walked me through the whole file, page by page, the way I'd walk a young man through a set of blueprints, and she showed me the trouble. Kevin had represented himself as acting for me. He'd supplied the closing office with everything they needed, except the one thing he could not legally supply, which was my true signature, given in person in front of a notary. And on the documents where that signature was required, someone had put down a version of my name. A poor version. A version that had never sat across a desk from Diane Whitfield or any other notary and signed in the flesh. "I'm going to be plain with you," Diane said, "because you strike me as a man who'd rather have it plain. What's in this file may be more than a family disagreement. A signature that isn't yours, on a document meant to transfer property that's legally yours. That's not just wrong. Depending on how it came to be there, it can be a crime. Forgery, fraud. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to tell you what to do about your own son. But I am telling you that this sale is dead. It will not close. Not with me, and once I file what I'm required to file, not with anybody. Your house is safe." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 2 months. "And Mr. Sorensen," she added softer, "there's one more thing you should know. You did the one thing my father never got the chance to do. You kept the deed clean, in your name, and you didn't sign anything in your grief. That's the whole ballgame. A lot of folks in your shoes would have signed something in those first terrible weeks just to make the person go away. You didn't. Somebody taught you patience." "My wife," I said, "and before her, my father. On that lake. Still water holds the most." Diane Whitfield looked at me for a moment, and then she smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her. "Well," she said, "it surely does." Before we left the diner, she laid out plainly what would happen next, so I'd know and not have to wonder. She would file what she was legally required to file about the file she couldn't in good conscience close. The sale would collapse. There was no way around that once the true owner had said, in his own voice, that he'd never agreed to it and never signed. And she told me, gently because she could see how it landed, that I ought to be ready for the fact that this would not stay quiet, and that my son would find out fast that his scheme had died, and that a cornered man doesn't always take that news gracefully. "Get a good lawyer between you and him before that happens," she said, "not because you're not strong enough to face him, because you shouldn't have to face him alone." She wrote Ruth Alvarez's name on a napkin and slid it across the table. Then she put her hand briefly over mine, an old woman's hand, dry and warm. "You're going to be all right, Mr. Sorensen. Your Maggie made sure of that. All we're doing now is reading out what she already wrote down. And I have thought many times since that that was the truest description of the whole business anyone ever gave me. All we were doing, from start to finish, was reading out what Maggie had already quietly written down. I wish I could tell you that once the sale fell through, my son came to his senses. That's not how it went. Not at first. Because a cornered man, especially a weak one, doesn't fold when his scheme collapses. He thrashes. And when Kevin learned the sale was dead, he thrashed. Diane, as she was required to do, would not let the transaction proceed, and the out-of-town buyer, smelling trouble, walked away fast. Kevin found out within a day or two that the deal had died, and instead of coming to me ashamed, he came to me angry. He showed up at my place in town, and this time Ashley was with him, waiting in the car at first, and then coming in when the voices rose. Kevin was pale and sweating. "Dad, what did you do?" The sale fell apart. The closing lady's saying there's some problem with the signatures. She's asking all these questions. "Dad, do you have any idea the position you put me in? I've got deposits down. I've got the venue booked. You've got my house," I said quietly. "That you tried to sell without my name on a single honest page." He stopped. For a second I saw the fear cross his face. The fear of a man who realizes the thing he did in the dark has been dragged into the light. And then, God help him, he tried to talk his way around it. He told me it was all a misunderstanding, that the signature business was just a paperwork mix-up, some clerical thing, that of course he'd have gotten my real signature at the end, that he was only trying to help me, to take the burden off me, that I was too grief-stricken to know what was good for me. And that was when Ashley spoke up from the doorway and showed me the bottom of it. "Walter," she said, in a voice that was trying to be reasonable and only sounded cold, "let's be honest here. You're 74. You just lost your wife. You're rattling around alone in a house full of memories. You shouldn't even be driving that road to the lake. Everybody can see you're not really up to managing all this anymore. Kevin's just trying to do what's best. And if you can't see that, if you're going to fight your own son over a pile of boards, then maybe the family needs to have a harder conversation about whether you're really in a state to be making these kinds of decisions at all." There it was, out in the open. If they couldn't take the house with a forged signature, they'd take it by taking me, by getting me declared unfit, unable to manage my own affairs, so that someone else, someone conveniently close, could manage them for me. It was the same move Diane's uncle had made on her father 40 years ago in another town. The oldest, ugliest move there is, make the victim out to be the crazy one, so no one listens when he says he's being robbed. I looked at Ashley and then at my son, who would not meet my eyes, who let his wife say the thing he didn't have the stomach to say himself, and I felt the last of my heartbreak turn into something clearer and colder. I'll tell you what went through me, standing there. It wasn't only anger, though there was plenty of that. It was a kind of grim clarity, the way a fog lifts off the lake and suddenly you can see the far shore. I saw, all at once, the whole shape of what they'd do if I let them. First the house, taken quiet if they could manage it, and when that failed, me, my freedom, my say over my own life, my very mind, put up for question in front of a judge. Is the old man really fit to decide? And once that seed is planted, it grows in people's minds like rot in a wetboard. Every ordinary thing an old man does, forgetting where he set his glasses, repeating a story, driving slow, gets folded in as evidence. I'd seen it happen to Diane's father through her own telling, 40 years and 200 miles away. And here it was again, the same ugly blueprint in my own kitchen, in my own son's silence while his wife did the talking. But I remembered what Diane had told me and what Maggie had taught me. Don't raise your voice. A man who shouts, "I'm not crazy," looks to people who want to believe it exactly like a crazy man. The strong thing, the patient thing, is not to thrash back. It's to be still, to let them overreach, to let them keep talking, keep grabbing, keep showing everyone exactly who they are, and to have the truth written down, waiting for its moment. So, I didn't shout. I stood up slow, an old carpenter in his own kitchen, and I said in a level voice, "You've both said your piece. Now I'll say mine, once. That lake house is mine. It is in my name, and only my name, and it is going to stay that way. There will be no sale. And if anyone wants to sit down with lawyers and papers and talk about who's fit to manage what, then by all means, let's sit down. Let's get everyone in a room and let's let the papers speak. I held the door open. Now I think you'd best go. They went. And in the quiet after the door shut, I stood a long time by the window, shaking a little, the way you shake after you've held steady through something that wanted to break you. It costs something, staying still when everything in you wants to roar. People think patience is easy, that it's just doing nothing. It isn't. Holding your peace while your own son and his wife stand in your kitchen and call you unfit, while they reach for your home and your freedom, holding steady through that, without giving them the shouting match they need to paint you as the crazy one. That's not doing nothing. That's the hardest work there is. It's like holding a heavy beam dead level while your arms scream. Anyone can drop it and let it crash. Holding it takes everything you've got, and I held it. For Maggie, for Emma, for the plain fact that the truth was on my side, and the truth doesn't need a man to scream on its behalf. It only needs him not to let go. Then I picked up the phone and called Diane Whitfield. And then I called a lawyer she'd told me to call, and I began, patiently, board by board, to build the thing that would end this for good. Over the next few weeks, I did what I'd done my whole working life. I built something, slow and true, piece by piece. Only this time, what I was building was the truth, laid out so plain that no one could argue with it. Diane put me in touch with a lawyer, a sharp young woman named Ruth Alvarez, who did elder law work and had no patience at all for people who preyed on the old. She took one look at the file Diane had flagged and got very quiet, and then very determined. "Mr. Sorensen," she said, "let me make sure I understand. Your son attempted to sell a property that is solely in your name, represented to a closing office that he had your authority, and a signature purporting to be yours appears on documents you never signed. Is that right?" I told her it was. She nodded slowly. "Then here is where we stand. The house is yours, free and clear, and no one can touch it. That part is simple. What's not simple is the rest of it, and that's a decision only you can make. Because what your son did may well be a crime, and you have every right to treat it as one. First, we made my ground unshakable. Ruth Alvarez was a small woman with a quiet voice and a spine like a steel stud. She'd spent her whole career, she told me, standing between old people and the ones circling them, and she'd stopped being surprised long ago by what families would do to each other over money and property. "The house is the easy part, Mr. Sorensen," she said. "What I want to be sure of is the rest. That when we're done, no one can ever come at you sideways again, through your competence, through a power of attorney, through anything. I don't just want to win this. I want to close every door they might try next and nail each one shut, so you can live out your life in peace on that lake without ever looking over your shoulder." I liked her. She talked like a person who builds things to last. And that's a language I speak. So we set our posts one at a time. We gathered the deed, my name, only my name, clean and recorded, going back 30 years. We had a good doctor, a real one, examine me and put it in writing that I was a sound, sharp, fully capable man of 74, who could manage his own affairs as well as anyone half his age. We did this because I knew what was coming. If they couldn't take the house, they'd try to take my competence, and I meant to have that door nailed shut before they reached it. When the doctor finished, she set down her pen and said, "Mr. Sorensen, I see a lot of families try to get me to write that an old parent is not competent, when what they really mean is not convenient. There's nothing wrong with your mind. I'll write that as plain as you like." I walked out with that paper feeling like I'd set a corner post in concrete. I want to stop on that a second, because it's a thing worth knowing. The move they were setting up against me, trying to get an old man declared unable to run his own life, works by a kind of quiet slander. It doesn't need proof. It just needs a fog. It needs enough people nodding along that poor Walt isn't really himself since Maggie passed. Until the fog is thick enough that nobody can see the plain fact underneath, which is that Walt is fine, and Walt is being robbed. The fog is the weapon, and the only thing that cuts fog is a clear, hard, documented fact. That doctor's letter was a searchlight. So were the deed, and the witnesses, and Maggie's will. One by one, I was setting down lights around myself that no fog could swallow. That's the lesson under the lesson, and I give it to you plain. Against a lie that works by fog, you don't argue louder. You gather facts in writing, and you let them shine. Then, the witnesses. And here is where I learned, all over again, that a man who's lived honest among his own people is never really alone, no matter how they try to isolate him. My old friend Hank, we fished that lake together for 50 years, was ready to stand up and swear I was as sound as a new keel. I have to tell you about Hank for a minute, because he's the kind of friend a man's lucky to have one of in a lifetime. We met as boys. We've pulled walleye out of that lake through 50 summers and augured holes through the ice through 50 winters. He's a man of few words and no nonsense, and when I finally told him the whole story, over coffee at his kitchen table, because some things you don't say on a phone, he sat still for a long time, and then he set down his cup and said, "Walt, that boy, I taught him to skip a stone off your dock." He shook his head slow. "I don't have the words for what he's done, but you tell me where to stand and what to say, and I'll be there and I'll say it, and I'll say it to a judge or to God himself. You're the truest man I know, and I'll not watch them make you out to be a fool. That's all. That's Hank." And there were more like him than I ever would have guessed. My neighbor down the road, my pastor, the fellow at the hardware store who'd sold me nails for 40 years, Diane Whitfield herself. Half of Birch Hollow, it turned out, would have lined up to say who Walt Sorensen was and who my son had become. They'd tried to make me a lonely, confused old man that nobody would believe. Instead, the truth had a whole town standing behind it. That's the thing the wolves forget, every time. They pick the old ones because they think the old ones are alone. But a man who spent his life being decent to his neighbors has 100 quiet debts owed back to him, and they all come due the day he needs them. Isolation was their whole plan, and the town blew it apart just by being the town. And then there was Maggie's will. Ruth Alvarez read it, and when she got to a certain part, she looked up at me with something soft in her hard eyes. "Mr. Sorensen, did you know what your wife did here?" And she told me, and I had to take my glasses off and press my eyes, because even from the grave, Maggie was still looking after us all. In her will, Maggie had left a small thing, not to Kevin, but held in trust for Emma. Money of her own, set aside, locked up tight where no parent, no step-parent, no debt, and no scheme could ever reach it, to come to our granddaughter when she turned 18 and not one day before. And she'd written a letter to go with it, in her own hand. Ruth read it to me. "I know my son has his troubles, and I pray he finds his way out of them. But I want to be sure that at least my Emma has something that is truly hers, safe, that no grown-up's hard times can ever take from her. Children shouldn't have to pay for the weakness of the ones who are supposed to protect them. My Maggie. From a hospital bed, dying, she hadn't spent her last strength on her own fear. She'd spent it building a wall around the two people she knew couldn't protect themselves. An old man too soft-hearted to see his own son clearly, and a little girl with a gap in her teeth. She'd read the folks one last time, and then she'd quietly, patiently made them safe, written down, nailed tight, waiting for the day it would be needed, like still water, holding what was deepest until the moment it had to give it up. "Miss Alvarez," I said, "when the time comes to lay all this out, I want that letter read, last. I want my son to hear, in his mother's own words, that she died having to protect her granddaughter from him, not to shame him." Well, I stopped. Maybe a little to shame him, but mostly because it might be the only thing left in this world that can still wake him up. Ruth Alvarez looked at me a long moment. "You're still trying to save him," she said, "after all this." "He's my son," I said. "The house I can defend with papers. Him, I don't know if anything can. But his mother might. Let's let her try." We gathered them all in a conference room at Ruth Alvarez's office on a cold, bright morning. I'd asked for that, rather than a courtroom. I wanted my son across a table from me, not across a gallery. Ruth had sent Kevin and Ashley a plain letter. "Come and sit down with your father, his lawyer, and the closing agent, and resolve this matter, or the matter will be resolved for you elsewhere, in ways you will like a great deal less." They came. Of course they came. When you've done what they'd done, the last thing you want is for it to be aired somewhere you can't control. I dressed for it the way I dressed for church. My good jacket, the one I'd worn to Maggie's funeral. I looked at myself in the mirror that morning, and I said, out loud, "Today, Walt, you don't raise your voice. Today you let the papers speak." We sat down around that long table, me, Ruth, and Diane Whitfield on one side, Kevin and Ashley and a lawyer they'd hired on the other. Kevin wouldn't look at me. Ashley looked at me too much, with that hard, ready expression, like she'd come to win. Their lawyer opened, smooth as you please. He talked about a grieving family, a stressful time, a misunderstanding between a well-meaning son and an elderly father, unfortunate but hardly worth anyone's ruin. He suggested we all just agree the sale was off, shake hands and move along, no harm done. He never once used the word forgery. He was very good at not using it. Then Ruth Alvarez said, quiet and even, "We're not going to say very much. We're going to read some documents instead, because my client spent 50 years as a builder, and he has a saying, a thing built true doesn't need to shout to hold. So let's let the true things do the holding." I felt the whole room turn toward me for a moment. The son who wouldn't meet my eyes, the daughter-in-law who stared too hard, their smooth lawyer with his hands folded. They were all braced, I think, for me to speak, for the old man to finally break his silence and rage, or plead, or crumble. I did none of it. I sat still, my hands flat on the table, the way you rest your hands on a good level and let it tell you the truth without you saying a word. Because it was not my turn to talk. It had never been my turn. It was the paper's turn. Maggie had taught me that. With her dying breath, don't raise your voice, let the papers speak, and I meant to honor it right to the end. And she began to read. She read the doctor's letter first. Walter Sorensen is a sound, competent, fully capable man in complete command of his affairs. She read it slow, and I watched Ashley's little speech about whether he's really in a state to be making these decisions turn to ash in the air. There would be no declaring me unfit. That door was nailed shut, and everyone in the room heard the nails go in. I looked across the table at Ashley when Ruth read the letter out, and I watched her understand that the one weapon she'd been saving, "Is the old man really all there?" had just been taken off the table for good, in writing, by a doctor with no dog in the fight. She looked away first. She read the list of witnesses, Hank, the pastor, the neighbors, the whole solid weight of a town that knew exactly who I was. "A man half his county will vouch for," Ruth said, "is not a confused old man alone. He's a respected man that someone tried to make out to be a confused old man alone. There's a difference, and it matters." Kevin was sweating now. His lawyer had stopped looking so smooth. Then Ruth laid the deed on the table and read it aloud. She read the legal description of the property, the lake, the North Shore, the house I'd built with my own hands, and then she read the owner's name, slow and clear, Walter J. Sorensen. That name, and no other. Sole owner, clean title, recorded 30 years ago. "No one," she said, looking up, "has any right to sell this house or any part of it against the will of that man. No one." I watched my son's face as she read it, and I saw the color drain right out of it. He'd built the whole thing, the buyer, the closing, the forged name, the cruelty of, you don't need a big empty house, on the belief that somehow, some way, that house was going to be his to sell. And now, a calm voice reading a single line off a piece of paper took it out from under him in a sentence. It was never his. It could never have been his, because the papers said so. Plain. I watched Ashley, too, in that moment. The hard, ready look she'd worn coming in, the look of a woman who'd come to win, flickered and went out. She turned to their hired lawyer with a sharp glance, half a question and half an accusation, as if to say, well, do something. But there was nothing for him to do. A lawyer can dance around a great many things, but he cannot dance around a clean deed with one name on it, recorded 30 years deep. In front of a document like that, all his smooth talk was worth about as much as sawdust. And that, friend, is the terrible quiet power of a thing set down true and kept in order. It doesn't argue. It doesn't raise its voice. It just sits there and is so, and everything false breaks against it. I had spent 50 years learning that a joint built true holds a load that shouting can't shift. Now I watched a whole scheme, months in the making, come apart against a single honest line of print while I sat with my hands folded and never said a word. But Ruth Alvarez wasn't finished. She set down the deed and picked up one last page, and her voice went gentler, which somehow made the whole room go stiller. "There's one more document I've been asked to read. It's the last will of Margaret Sorensen, Mr. Sorensen's late wife, Kevin's mother, and a letter she wrote by hand in her final days." The room went silent as deep water. Ruth read the part where Maggie locked away a small inheritance for Emma, safe, untouchable, waiting for the girl to grow up. And then she read the letter. She read it all in a plain, steady voice. I know my son has his troubles, and I pray he finds his way out of them. But I want to be sure that at least my Emma has something that is truly hers. Safe. That no grown-up's hard times can ever take from her. Children shouldn't have to pay for the weakness of the ones who are supposed to protect them. When Ruth read those words, I had to look down at my own hands on the table, because I couldn't watch my son's face and keep my own together at the same time. There was so much of Maggie in that letter. No rage in it, no blame. Just the clear, fierce, tender love of a mother and a grandmother who, knowing she was dying, spent her last strength not on her own fear, but on building a shelter over the two people she knew couldn't shelter themselves. A soft-hearted old man who couldn't see his own son plain, and a little girl with a gap in her teeth. She'd read the folks one last time, and then, quiet and patient, she'd made them safe, set it down, locked it tight, left it waiting for the day it would be needed, like still water, holding what was deepest until the very moment it had to give it up. When she finished, nobody in that room moved. And then I heard the sound I will never forget as long as I live. My son, Kevin, put his face in his hands, and he wept. Not the practiced crying of a man caught out. Real weeping, the kind that comes up from the bottom. Because losing the house across a conference table was one thing, but hearing his dead mother's own words read out plain, telling him that in her last days on this earth, she'd had to build a wall to protect her granddaughter from him. That was something else entirely. His mother had seen what he was becoming, and she'd told him so, from beyond the grave, without a shred of anger, with nothing but a mother's terrible sorrow. I didn't feel triumph watching him break. I want you to understand that. I felt only a deep and tired grief. I had won, and there is no lonelier victory in this world than the one you win against your own child. Watching him weep with his face in his hands, two men were fighting inside me. There was the wronged old man, the one who'd been humiliated, who had every right to sit back and savor the moment like a cold drink. And there was just the father, the one who'd taught that boy to fish, who'd cried the day he emptied his piggy bank for a widow. And the father won. Because looking at Kevin come apart, I didn't see the man who'd tried to sell my home. I saw for the first time in years that boy again, buried deep, finally hearing the truth about who he'd let himself become. And there's a pain in that seeing, a man forced to look square at himself, that no punishment a court could hand down would ever match. The papers had taken back the house, but his mother's words had taken away the lies he'd been hiding behind. And for a man, that's the harder loss by far. I was glad in that moment that Emma wasn't in the room. I'd insisted she stay out of all of it, kept safe with Hank's wife, far from the ugliness of grown people. But I thought of her sitting there. I thought that someday when she's grown, I might tell her this story, and that the lesson I'd hand her wouldn't be, look how your grandpa beat your father. It would be, look how, when everything came apart, the truth and a little dignity were still left standing. Look how you can win without becoming the thing that hurt you. I hadn't raised my voice, not once in that whole room. I had only let the papers speak. The sale was dead and buried. The house was mine, safe, unshakable, exactly as Maggie had made sure it would be. And I walked out of that office with my home intact and my heart in pieces, which is the strange arithmetic of these things. You can win everything and still lose something that doesn't have a price. There was the matter of what to do about the forged signature. Ruth Alvarez laid it out for me honestly. I had every right to go to the authorities. What Kevin had done, or had let be done, was likely a crime, and no one would blame me for treating it as one. She would stand behind whatever I chose, and I thought about it, long and hard, out on that dock where I do my best thinking. In the end, I made my choice, and I'll tell you what it was, though I know some will think me a fool for it. I didn't send my son to jail. I chose instead to keep the truth documented. Every page, every proof, all of it preserved and in Ruth's safe hands, so that it could never be denied, and so that if he ever tried anything like it again, the consequences would fall on him like a dropped beam. But I did not press it into a criminal case, not out of weakness, out of something Maggie would have understood, because Emma still needed a father, and a father in a cell is no father to a little girl, and because justice, real justice, was never the same thing as revenge. I had my house. I had the truth, plain and preserved. I did not need my son's ruin on top of it, Mercy, when you can afford it, is not the same as surrender. I could afford it, so I gave it. Ashley did not stick around to see how it played out. Once it was clear there'd be no lake house, no wedding money, no ballroom, and once the whole county knew what she and Kevin had tried to do to a grieving old man, she was gone within the month. I won't pretend I grieved her leaving, but I'll tell you it brought me no joy either. Nobody really wins in a story like this. Everybody loses something. She left behind a broken man and a bewildered little girl, and went looking for her shining life somewhere else. The town, of course, came to know most of it. Small towns always do. And Birch Hollow was not gentle with the news that Kevin Sorensen had tried to sell his grieving father's lake house out from under him, with his mother barely in the ground, and had been stopped cold by the very papers Maggie left behind. Shame is a currency that spreads fast in a place like ours. But I'll tell you the part that mended something in me. The morning after word got around, I woke to find that someone had left a fresh-caught stringer of walleye hanging on my porch rail, cleaned and ready for the pan, no note. Then Hank's wife brought a hot dish. Then the pastor stopped by, just to sit. All week it went like that. Quiet, wordless kindnesses from people who'd known me my whole life and wanted, in the only way country folks know how, to tell me they were on my side. They'd tried to make me a lonely old man that nobody would stand up for. And the town answered that without a single speech, just by being the town. That's the thing the loud ones and the hurried ones never understand. A life lived decent among your neighbors is a kind of savings account you can't see, and it pays out exactly when you need it most. And Kevin came to me a few weeks after that day at the table, alone this time. He didn't use his key. He stood on my porch and knocked, and when I opened the door, he couldn't hardly lift his eyes. And then he came apart, right there on the step, the way he had at the conference table, and it all came pouring out. The debt, worse than I'd ever guessed. The venture that had collapsed. The pressure from Ashley, always more, always bigger. And how, drowning, he'd told himself a story where selling the lake house was doing me a favor, where I was too old and too sad to know what was good for me, where it wasn't really so wrong to hurry an old man's signature along, or to let one be hurried for him. I told myself so many lies, Dad, he said. I needed every one of them, so I wouldn't have to see what I was doing. And then I heard Mom's letter, and I understood I'd become the thing she was scared of, the thing she had to protect Emma from. Me, her son. He put his face in his hands. How did I get here, Dad? How did I turn into this? I didn't answer him right off because there wasn't an easy answer, and because a lie told to comfort him would have been the opposite of what that moment needed. A man who truly wants to change doesn't need comforting. He needs to be seen for exactly what he is, and loved anyway. So I let him get it all out. And it came. The debt, deeper than I'd ever dreamed, one loan taken to cover another. The venture that had cratered. Ashley, always pushing, always more, always bigger. And him too weak and too frightened of losing her to ever tell her no. I told myself you were too old to know what was good for you, he said, wiping his face with the back of his hand like a boy. I told myself the house was as good as mine anyway, that I was just moving up the timeline. I told myself 100 things, Dad, and I needed every single one of them so I wouldn't have to look at what I was actually doing. And then I heard Mom's letter read out loud in that room. Children shouldn't have to pay for the weakness of the ones who are supposed to protect them. And I understood that I'd become the weakness she meant. I was the one she had to protect Emma from. Me, her boy. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, and we talked a long time. It was not one of those forgivenesses you see in the movies, all wrapped up with a hug and everything mended. Some breaks don't close over a cup of coffee. But it was a start. I told him the truth, without sparing him and without grinding him down. Kevin, you did a terrible thing. You tried to take my home and my good name, with your mother barely in the ground. I can't pretend that didn't happen. It's going to be a long time before I can trust you again, and you'll have to earn that back a day at a time, with what you do, not with what you cry. But you're my son, and I promised your mother I'd let the papers speak. I never promised her I'd stop loving you. The papers have spoken. Now, if you want to, we can try to build something new, but we build it honest, board by board, or we don't build it at all. And that was where my son began the long, slow work of becoming a man again. He faced his debts instead of running from them. He found real work, plain and modest, the kind that doesn't make you rich but lets you sleep at night. And most of all, he became a father to Emma again, present this time, steady, instead of a man drowning in his own schemes. Because Emma came back to me. That was the sweetest thing of all. The first weekend Kevin brought her up to the lake again, that little girl came flying up the dock hollering, "Grandpa!" and threw herself into my arms. And I held her, and I wept, but with joy this time, not with grief. I took her out to the end of the dock, into the cold, still morning, and I put a fishing rod back in her hands. "Sit still now, Emma Bug," I whispered. "Still water holds the most. You remember?" "I remember, Grandpa," she whispered back, and she sat, patient as an old woman, watching her line on the quiet water. And I looked out over Loon Lake, at the mist lifting the way it had lifted every morning of my life. And I thought of Maggie, and I knew for certain, that somewhere she was watching the two of us on that dock, and she was smiling. It's been more than a year now, since that morning at the long table. And let me tell you how things sit, because a story's only worth the telling if it goes all the way down to the ordinary days that come after. The lake house is still mine, safe and clear. But I did one thing, with Ruth Alvarez's help, that I'm as proud of as anything I ever built. I made out a new will of my own, and like Maggie, I chose to protect the future instead of feeding the old wound. I set it down, plain and locked tight, that when I'm gone, that lake house goes to Emma, not to Kevin, but straight to Emma, my granddaughter with the gap in her teeth, held in trust so that no one ever can pressure her into selling it or take it from her hands until she's grown and able to decide for herself. The house my son once stood in my kitchen and sold out from under me to pay for a party is going to become the protected home of a little girl. The boards a woman looked at and thought, "This'll sell for plenty," will one day belong to the child who looks at them and thinks, "This is where Grandpa taught me to fish." I didn't do it to punish Kevin. I told him about it, straight to his face. Because I do my dealings in the light, unlike the ones who did this to me. I said, "Kevin, the house goes to Emma. Not because I can't forgive you, but because your mother and I both learned the same hard lesson. Houses don't survive passing through the hands of grown-ups who are in a hurry and in debt. If I leave it to you, it'll be sold inside a year against the next emergency, and Emma will have nothing. If I leave it to her, locked up, it stays. In the family. For good. It's the only way I know to protect everybody, including you, from yourself." And this time, Kevin didn't argue. He looked at the floor a long moment, and then he said, quiet, "You're right, Dad. That's the right thing. It's more than I deserve." That sentence, "it's more than I deserve," told me more than any apology could have, because the man who'd walked into my kitchen with the sale already done believed he deserved everything. The man standing in front of me now, saying, "more than I deserve," had found his way back to something he'd lost a long time ago, the plain humility of an honest man. And humility, for a fellow like Kevin, is where every repair has to start. We work at it, him and me, a day at a time. He comes up to the lake on Sundays now and helps me with the things my hands have gotten too stiff to do alone. The storm windows, the dock in spring, the split wood. The first few times we worked in silence, awkward as two strangers. But little by little we started talking again. Not about the big things, those still cut too deep. About small things, the weather, the fishing, Emma's spelling tests. And I'll tell you, some afternoons, working beside him under the pines I planted, I catch a glimpse, just a glimpse, of that boy who emptied his piggy bank for a widow. He's not all the way back, maybe he never will be, but a piece of him is. And for a father, even a piece of the son you thought you'd lost is a mercy past all deserving. He's paying down the debt with that plain, honest work. And one thing he did put a lump in my throat I couldn't swallow. On his own, he insisted on paying me back, a little each month, for the lawyer and the doctor and all it cost me to defend myself, against him. I tried to wave it off. He wouldn't have it. "No, Dad. This part I've got to do. It's the least of it. I'll not have you out $1 for having to protect yourself from your own son." And in the plain little envelope he brings by every month, I finally believed the change was real. Because words are cheap and tears are cheaper. It's the deeds, set down in black and white, that tell you the truth of a man. Emma comes up most every weekend now. Out on the dock in the early quiet, I've taught her to bait her own hook and to sit so still the dragonflies land on her rod. Last month she wanted to make a sign for the shed, and she worked at it a whole afternoon, tongue between her teeth the way I do when I'm concentrating, and when she was done, she showed it to me, glowing with pride. In her careful crooked letters, it read, Sorensen's Dock, Grandpa and Emma. I hung it on the shed, right over the old maple workbench, and it'll stay there, because some things, when you build them true and set them where they belong, are meant to last. Sometimes, in the evening, I sit on the porch I built to face the sunset, and I talk to Maggie a little, the way old widowers do. You see, Mag, it held. I never raised my voice, not once. I let the papers speak just like you told me, and the papers saved us all. Even Kevin, maybe. Even him. And in the still of that lake, with the loons calling and the light going gold on the water, it seems to me I can almost hear her answer in that patient, knowing way she had. Of course it held, Walt. I built it true, and I wrote it down. The lake house is still mine. I spend my summers there now, the way Maggie and I always did, and Emma comes up most weekends when Kevin has her. The dock I built still runs out into the same still water. The sun still goes down over the lake every evening, red and gold, the way I built that porch to catch it. And the house that my son once stood in my kitchen and sold out from under me is full of life again. I want to tell you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching from tonight, your town, your city, your quiet corner of the world, what this whole hard business taught me. My son came at me loud and fast and sure of himself, certain he'd already won because he had the confident voice and I was just a broken old man. He believed that pushing hard enough was the same as being right. He believed the loud and the quick always beat the slow and the still. He was wrong, because against all his noise, there was something stronger and quieter, the plain truth, written down, patient, waiting. It never shouted, it just sat there, clean and level, and when the moment came, it held, and all his noise fell right off it. So, here is what I'd hand to you, the way my father handed me his tools. First, put the important things in writing while you still can, while your mind is clear and strong, a deed kept clean, a will made plain, your wishes set down, signed, recorded, safe. Maggie saved me and saved Emma not with shouting, but with 2 quiet documents she prepared while she still could. If you love someone who's growing weak, an old parent, a child, protect them with paper before the day of trouble comes. Paper is the shield of the gentle. Second, never sign anything that matters in a hurry, in grief, or under pressure, ever. The one who rushes you, who frightens you, who won't let you have the papers read by someone you trust, that one is trying to take something from you. An honest person always gives you time. Time is a friend to the truth and an enemy to a lie. Third, watch over the old ones who are alone. They're the ones the wolves circle, not the rich and surrounded, but the ones nobody's checking on. A phone call, a visit, a question asked out loud can undo a scheme that was counting on silence and isolation. The best protection an old person has isn't a lock on the door. It's being loved, being seen, mattering to somebody. A man his whole town knows is never truly alone, no matter how hard they try to make him one. And there's one more, before the last one, that I had to learn standing on that dock deciding what to do about my own son. Justice is not the same thing as revenge. When it was all over, I could have pressed everything, sent Kevin to answer for the forged name in front of a judge, watched him ruined all the way down. No one would have blamed me, and I'll be honest, a part of me wanted to. But I thought of Emma needing a father, and I thought of what Maggie would have wanted, and I understood that I already had everything justice owed me. I had my house. I had the truth, set down and safe and undeniable. Ruining my son on top of that wouldn't have been justice. It would only have been my own hurt, dressed up as justice. So, I kept the truth documented, every page of it, where it could never be denied and would fall like a dropped beam on him if he ever tried such a thing again. And I stopped there. Mercy, when you can afford it, isn't weakness. It's the last thing a strong man does, once the truth has already won. Hold your dignity even in your anger, especially in your anger. And last, the hardest and the truest. The danger for an old man almost never comes from the stranger. It comes from inside, from the blood of your own blood. We guard against the scammer on the phone, the crook at the door, and we drop every defense we have in front of a son, because the heart refuses to believe that someone we love could do us harm. That's exactly what they count on. I'm not telling you to distrust the ones you love. That's a poor, cold way to live. I'm telling you that love and prudence aren't enemies. You can love your child with your whole heart and still keep your papers in order, still refuse to sign in a hurry, still keep one wise friend outside the family who'll tell you the truth when your heart won't. Maggie loved Kevin, and she kept her head, and her clear head saved us all, his own soul included in the end. I'm not a man for big speeches about heaven, but I'll tell you this one thing. Maggie's last words to me were, "Don't raise your voice. Still, water holds the most. Let the papers speak." Those words saved my home and my dignity and maybe my son. And I don't believe a woman who spends her dying strength quietly building a shelter over the ones she loves ever really leaves them. She stays, like still water, like a thing built true. My Maggie used to say the deepest things don't make the most noise. They just hold. She was right. She was always right about the folks. And she was right about this. If this story has meant something to you tonight, leave a comment down below. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me, if you would, who you thought of while you listened. What old parent, what lonely neighbor, what person you love who might need looking after. Share this with somebody who's got an old one to protect or a heart that needs waking up. It might open somebody's eyes in time. And subscribe to the channel if you'd like to sit with me again for more stories of truth and dignity and family and the quiet kind of justice. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Your time is a precious thing, and you gave an old man some of it tonight. I won't forget it. One last thing before I let you go. The stories on this channel may carry details that have been changed for the telling, and this one is no different, so take it as a story and not a sworn account. But let me leave you with an old builder's secret. In this life, there's the loud and there's the true, and they are almost never the same thing. The loud fills the room, and then it's gone, like a shout over water. The true doesn't make much noise at all. It can sit quiet for years, like a name on a deed in a drawer, like still water holding what's deepest. And it looks, to the loud and the hurried, like nothing, like weakness, like an old man saying nothing at all. But when the noise dies down, when the pushy ones have finished shouting and think they've won, it's the true thing, the quiet thing, that's still standing. So build your life true, keep it level and keep it honest, and don't be afraid to be still, because a home, a family, a life was never meant to belong to whoever shouts the loudest. It was meant to last, like good work, like deep water, for the ones who built it right and for the ones who come after. Take care of yourself and take care of your own. And still water, friend, still water holds the most.